Picture a man who has been away 5 years, stepping down from a travelling carriage in the grey light of a Haramir morning, so certain of his welcome that he does not even glance back at the woman on his arm. He has rehearsed nothing, because he believes there is nothing to rehearse. He believes the house will open to him the way a door opens for a key. He believes the fires will already be lit in his rooms, the accounts laid out neat for his signature, and the wife he left standing on these very steps, still standing there, patient, faithful, a little greyer perhaps, waiting to be told at last that she may be forgiven for the sin of having been dull. He straightens his gloves. He looks up at the house he owns and has not thought of in months, and he smiles the smile of a man who has never once in his life been refused anything he truly wanted. And he does not yet know that the woman inside that house has become someone his hands could never hold. If you have ever loved someone who mistook your patience for weakness, who took your silence as consent, who left and expected to find you exactly where they had set you down like a chair pushed against a wall, then you already know the particular cold that lives at the centre of this story. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from. And if you believe a woman's worth was never in being chosen, say it plainly, because this is a story about a woman who learnt that lesson so completely that the man who taught it to her could not understand what he was looking at when he came home. Subscribe and stay with me to the end, because the Duke of Haramir is about to discover that the heart he abandoned did not break the way he imagined it would. It did not shatter. It did not beg. It simply turned quietly, permanently towards someone else, and left him standing in the cold he had made. To understand how a proud man came to stand unwelcome on his own steps, we have to go back, all the way back to where it truly began, to a marriage that was never a marriage at all, but a transaction dressed in white silk and signed with a steady hand at a cold altar. Go back with me and watch how the quietest woman in the county became the one thing her husband never learned to read. Eleanor came to Haramir the way money comes to an old name, quietly and by arrangement, with no more ceremony in the deciding of it than there is in the moving of a sum from one column of a ledger to another. Her father was a merchant with 3 ships and no title. A man who had learned across a hard lifetime that in England a fortune without a name is a house without a roof, always at the mercy of weather it cannot control, always one bad season from ruin. Julian's family had the opposite trouble. They had a name older than the cathedral in the county town, a name that opened every door in the country, and coffers so empty that they echoed when you dropped a coin into them. So the fathers met, and then the solicitors met, and a settlement was drawn up that moved Eleanor's dowry into the Haramir accounts, and moved Eleanor herself into the Haramir house, and everyone at the signing agreed it was a very good match indeed. Eleanor was 19 years old. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped rooms and started rumours, but she was clever in a way that unsettled them. And she had a habit of understanding a thing before it had finished being explained to her, which men of Julian's circle found charming for exactly 1 season and tiresome forever after. On her wedding day she stood in the cold cathedral in a gown that had cost more than a tenant earned in a decade, and she watched her new husband's eyes move past her face to the tall windows, to the horses waiting in the yard, and then to a woman in a blue pelisse 3 pews back, and she understood, the way she understood a column of figures, at a single glance. that she had been purchased and would now be shelved. She did not cry. Understand that about her from the very first, because everything that follows grows from it. She did not cry, because she had already learned in her father's crowded house that a woman who offers her opinion unasked is a woman who is asked less and less until she is asked nothing at all. And so, on the morning of her wedding, she folded her cleverness away like a good dress kept for a day that never seems to come. And she made her face smooth, and she said the vows in a clear voice, and she meant every one of them, which was more than could be said for the man beside her. The house was beautiful, and it was cold, and I do not only mean the draughts that moved through the long gallery like tenants who paid no rent. Julian, Duke of Haramere, was polite at breakfast and gone by supper. He rode, he shot, he kept a stable of horses he loved more than any person, and a cellar he loved more than the horses, and he went up to London for the season and came back smelling of a perfume that was not hers and telling her nothing of where he had been. He treated Eleanor with the distant, unfailing courtesy a man shows to a competent upper servant whom he has no intention of ever truly seeing, and if you had asked him in those years whether he was unkind to his wife, he would have been genuinely surprised, because he never raised his voice to her and never struck her, and never once, in all their marriage, so much as noticed her enough to be cruel. That was the whole of it. He did not hate her, he simply did not see her, and there is a kind of loneliness in being unseen by the one person the whole world says is yours that is colder than any open cruelty, because you cannot even name your wound without being told you have no cause to complain. And Eleanor, given nothing to love, learned to love the estate instead. She learned the accounts because no one else would keep them honestly. She learned the names of the tenant families as though they were her own kin. The Bardens who farmed the flood-prone low fields with a stubborn courage that broke her heart. The Holts whose great mill had stood idle and rotting since Julian's grandfather's day. The widow Cray who took in the parish orphans one after another and asked the estate for nothing, and received exactly that. She learned which fields flooded and which held, which leases were fair, and which had been quietly rewritten to squeeze one more shilling from people who could not spare a single penny. And she learned all of it in silence. And Mrs. Pell, the housekeeper, watching the young Duchess move through the cold house with her ledgers and her quiet corrections, said once, to no one at all, that the Duchess was the only soul at Haramere who behaved as though the place would still be standing in 100 years, and would still be worth standing. It was Mr. Rook who first taught Eleanor, without ever meaning to, that silence could be a strategy, and not only a wound. Rook was the estate solicitor, a soft grey man with a soft grey voice and soft grey hands that were never quite still, and he had been at Haramere long enough that Julian trusted him the way a man trusts a chair he has always sat in, comfortably and without ever once examining its legs. Eleanor examined the legs. She could not help it, it was how she was made. She noticed, in the second year of her marriage, that money left the accounts on quarter days, and did not entirely arrive where the ledgers swore it had gone. She noticed that leases were being redrawn in Rook's careful hand, that the fair rents she had memorized were creeping upward on paper, while the tenants stood in the yard and swore on their mothers' graves they had agreed to no such increase. She noticed that Rook smiled a very great deal when the Duke was in the room, and did not smile at all when he was not, and that he spoke to her, On the rare occasions he could not avoid it, in the slow, patient tone a man uses on a child or a horse. And she did what she always did with a thing she did not yet understand. She began to write it down. Not accusations, never accusations, only observations, each one dated and initialed in a small plain book she kept locked in the drawer of her own writing desk. A sum that did not match, a date that did not fit, a signature that leaned the wrong way. She had no proof yet, only the growing shape of a suspicion, and she knew, the way she knew everything, that a suspicion spoken aloud without proof to carry it hands the guilty man the high ground and hands the injured woman the reputation of a hysteric and a scold. Accuse a clever man without evidence, she wrote once in the margin of her book, and you do not wound him, you arm him. So she waited. She noted and she noted and she waited, and the small book grew heavy with patience. And Rook went on smiling his soft grey smile, entirely unaware that the dull Duchess was building, one entry at a time, the rope that would one day hang him. Camille Vasseur arrived in the 4th year of the marriage, and she arrived the way a fire arrives, beautifully and with the settled intention of consuming everything in the room. She was the widow of a French officer, or so she said, and no one troubled to check, and she had a laugh that made ordinary men feel witty, and a way of laying 2 fingers on a sleeve that made a vain man feel chosen out of all the world. Within a single month she had made herself indispensable to Julian in the particular way that a certain kind of woman knows how to do, by becoming the mirror in which he looked his very best. And Julian, who had never in his life been able to resist his own reflection, was lost almost before he knew he was in danger. Eleanor watched it happen with the flat, attentive calm of a woman reading a letter she has received many times before. She saw the perfume return, stronger now, to the collars of Julian's coats. She saw, at the midsummer assembly, a bracelet she did not recognize on Camille's slim wrist, a bracelet whose stones she was almost certain had been prized from a setting once listed in the Haramir inventory under the plain and quiet heading of the late Duchess's jewels. She saw the money move faster now, and in larger sums, and she saw, across a crowded and candle-bright drawing-room, Rook and Camille exchange a single glance that was in no way the glance of strangers meeting in a great house. It was the glance of partners. And in that moment something in Eleanor's understanding turned over and clicked into a new and colder shape. This was no longer merely a broken heart. A broken heart is a private grief, a thing a woman can carry quietly to her grave if she must, and no one need ever know. This was theft. This was the slow, deliberate, patient stripping of a house and a name and a future, worked by 2 clever people who had between them decided that the dull, loyal wife was too stupid to notice and too meek to matter, and who had further decided, whether they had said it aloud or not, that when the ruin finally came, it would be her name and not theirs that carried the blame. Eleanor closed her small book that night and sat for a long while in the dark, and she understood with a clarity that felt almost like relief that waiting was no longer enough. Soon, and not too soon, she would have to act once completely in a way that could never be undone and never need be done twice. What sealed it was not the bracelet and not the money, but a single sentence spoken through a half-open door on a warm evening when Julian believed his wife long abed. Eleanor had come down for a book she had left in the small library, and she stopped in the dark passage because she heard her own name, and she did the thing that changes a life, which is to stand still And listen. Camille's voice, low and amused, was asking Julian whether he did not fear that his clever wife would one day notice what was being done to the accounts. And Julian laughed, the easy, careless laugh of a man who has never once been made to pay for a mistake, and he said, "Eleanor, she is loyal, and she is dull, and she suspects nothing. She has not had an original thought in her life. She keeps my house, and she asks no questions. And that is the whole of her use to me. Loyal and dull, and suspects nothing." Eleanor stood in the dark with her book forgotten in her hand, and she did not gasp, and she did not weep, and she did not fling open the door. She simply took the 3 words he had thrown away, loyal and dull and unsuspecting, and she carried them upstairs like 3 cold stones, and she laid them one by one in the foundation of the thing she was building. Because a man who believes you suspect nothing will do all his work in front of you. His contempt, she understood, was the finest tool she owned. She would let him keep it right up until the morning it undid him. But she did not act yet, because a woman who moves before her evidence is complete, moves only once, and then only in the wrong direction, and is never permitted to move again. Instead, she did the thing that would in time save her, though she did not yet know it would save her, and did not do it for saving. She began to build. The great Holt mill had fallen half to ruin because Julian would not spend a shilling on a thing that did not amuse him, and Eleanor, using the small quarterly allowance that was hers by the settlement to spend without his signature, quietly commissioned its repair. To oversee such a work she needed a man who understood land and machinery and honest accounts, all 3, a rare enough combination. And the man the widow Cray shyly recommended was a land agent lately come down from the north, a man named Thomas Aldern, who arrived at the mill with good mud on his boots and a plain dark coat gone shiny at the elbows, and a way of looking at a broken and rotting thing, not with despair, as most men did, but with a kind of patient appetite, as though every ruin in the world were only a difficult question waiting for the right and careful answer. Thomas did not know that Eleanor was a duchess when first he met her, because she came to the mill in her plainest grey cloak and let him assume she was the steward's wife, or a woman of the household with an unusual head for figures, and Thomas, believing her his equal, treated her as one. And that changed everything, though neither of them knew it yet. He argued with her, plainly and without deference, about the placing of the sluice gates. He gave way to her about the accounts, because her arithmetic was faster and truer than his, and he was not the kind of man whose pride demanded he pretend otherwise. He asked her opinion of a thing, and then, astonishingly, he waited for the answer, and he listened to the whole of it, and he changed his own settled mind when her answer proved the better one, and he thanked her for the correction without the smallest sourness. And Eleanor, who had not been sincerely asked her opinion in 5 long years of marriage, felt something in the middle of her chest that she had believed had frozen solid in a cold cathedral turn very slightly over and, faint as a first thaw, begin once more to breathe. There was an afternoon, late in that first autumn, that she would remember for the rest of her life, though nothing happened in it that a stranger would have thought worth remembering. They had been arguing, she and Thomas, over the accounts for the new sluice, and she had won the argument with a column of figures, and instead of sulking he had sat back on an upturned crate and looked at her with open, unguarded admiration and said, "Whoever taught you to reckon like that did the world a kindness. It is a waste." A woman with a head like yours kept indoors keeping someone else's linen. He meant it as the plainest compliment, with no idea of the wound he had pressed, and Eleanor had turned her face to the window so he would not see it move. "No one taught me," she said at last. "Quietly, I taught myself, because it was the one thing no one could take away." And Thomas had nodded slowly, as though she had said something wise rather than something sad, and he said, "Those are the only things worth having, the things you make yourself. A title is given, a skill is earned. I would rather stand on a thing I earned." He did not know, could not have known, that he had just described, in two plain sentences, the whole difference between the man she had married and the man she was learning, dangerously, to trust. She said nothing more. But that night she wrote in the margin of her small book, not an observation about the accounts, but 4 words she did not entirely understand, he asks, and he listens. It was the first entry she had ever made that was not about money. She would not let herself name the feeling, not then. There was far too much to do, and naming it would have made it a thing she could lose. So she poured it into the work instead. The mill came back to life first as a trickle, and then, over a single hard-worked season, as a steady hum that could be heard across the low fields, and the flour it ground was honest weight at an honest price. And the Holt family, who had thought themselves finished and were making quiet plans to leave the only land they had ever known, found themselves instead the employers of half the low village. Word travelled the way good news always travels in a poor place, slowly at first and then all at once, and the tenants began to carry their troubles and their small disputes to the Duchess at the mill instead of to Rook at the great house, because the Duchess listened and Rook only calculated. Out of the mill's first true profits, Eleanor mended the Barden roof before the autumn rains could finish what the years had begun. She settled 2 of the widow Cray's orphans into decent apprenticeships in the county town, and stood the indentures herself. And all the while, under the honest daylight work, she kept her other secret labour going, for she kept 2 sets of books now. There was the false one, the one that Rook saw and believed he controlled, in which the estate limped politely toward the ruin he was engineering, and there was the true one, the growing one, the one locked in her writing desk, in which every forged lease was copied out in full beside its honest original, every vanished sum was traced patiently from the account it left to the account it entered. Every date and every leaning signature was preserved and pressed flat like a flower in a book. Mrs. Pell, who it turned out had a locked drawer of her own, full of family letters everyone had believed long since burned, began quietly to add to the Duchess's evidence, laying an old letter here, an old receipt there, without a word ever passing between them about what it was for. The nervous young bank clerk in the county town, whom Rook had once humiliated in public over a trifling error to prove his own importance, began of his own accord to keep private duplicates of every Harrowmere transaction, and to leave them folded where Eleanor's woman would find them. Eleanor never had to ask any of them outright, and this was the quiet genius of how she worked. For she had learned that loyalty cannot be bought the way Rook bought things, but must be earned in advance, in 100 small kindnesses that look at the time like nothing at all. Mrs. Pell had served the family for 30 years and been thanked before Eleanor came, perhaps twice. Eleanor thanked her daily, and remembered her sister's illness. and sat with her once through a bad night when the fever was high, and so when the housekeeper unlocked her private drawer at last and drew out a bundle of the old Duke's letters tied in faded ribbon, she laid them in Eleanor's hands and said only, "I kept them because I did not trust the man who wanted them burned. I did not know then what they were for. I think perhaps you do." And she was right. The letters proved the accounts had been sound before Rook's time, which meant the ruin had a beginning, and a beginning has an author. The young bank clerk had been shamed by Rook before a room full of his betters, and Eleanor had done nothing more that day than catch his eye afterward in the street and say clearly, so that others heard, that she had reviewed the matter herself and the error had not been his at all. He never forgot it. A man will risk a great deal for the one person who defended his name when it cost her nothing to stay silent. One by one they came to her, not because she commanded them, but because she had, without ever calculating it, made herself the only person at Harrowmere worth being loyal to. Piece by patient piece, testimony by quiet testimony, the case assembled itself in the locked drawer. And Eleanor came to understand that what she was building was not, in the end, revenge. Or not only revenge. It was a fact so complete and so heavy that no man alive would ever be able to argue with it. It was the truth, made too heavy for any lie to lift. And then, in the 5th year, Julian solved a problem he did not know his wife had, by removing himself from the field entirely. He announced it at breakfast, as he announced everything to her, without once looking up from his letters, buttering his bread as he spoke. He was going abroad, he said, to Italy first and then on to Vienna, for his health and his amusement, and to escape the tedium of an English winter. Camille would accompany the party, as a friend of the family and a woman who knew the continent well. Eleanor would of course remain at Harrowmere to see to the house, as she always did, as she was so very good at doing. He said it the way one gives an instruction to a fixture, kindly enough, expecting no answer beyond agreement, and Eleanor inclined her head over her teacup and said that she quite understood, and that she hoped he would find the son he was looking for. Inside the private and well-defended country of her own mind, a great door swung silently open on oiled hinges, because a man who is present, even a negligent and foolish one, is a man who can still sign, who can still countermand, who can still be flattered by Rook over a bottle of claret into putting his name to the ruin of his own tenants. A man who is 1,000 miles away chasing the Italian sun is a man who has walked off the board and handed his enemy the whole of it. Julian left 3 days later in a great clatter of trunks and grooms and stamping horses, with Camille laughing bright and clear beside him in the carriage, and neither of them so much as glanced back at the house as the gates fell behind them. And the last thing Eleanor felt, standing on the steps in the thin morning light, watching the dust of them settle, was not grief, and was not anger, and was not even the old cold loneliness. It was the clean, sharp, almost frightening relief of a long-held prisoner who hears the gaoler's footsteps at last fade all the way down the corridor and knows, for the first time in years, that she is alone with her own life. She had been granted 5 years. She would not need 5. She turned back into the house that was now, in every way that truly mattered, hers, and she rolled up her sleeves, and she got to work. What Julian could not know, what he was constitutionally and permanently incapable of even imagining, was that his sudden restlessness had not been his own idea at all. It had been arranged. Rook and Camille had wanted him gone, and had spent months gently making England tedious to him and the continent bright. Because a duke abroad signs whatever is sent after him with a fond, careless note and a request for more money, and asks no questions, and a duke abroad cannot see his own tenant families turned weeping off the land their grandfathers had cleared. In Julian's long absence the scheme, which had crept for years, now reached greedily for everything at once, believing its moment had come. Leases were forged wholesale in Rook's careful hand. Eviction notices were drawn up against families who had farmed Haramere earth for 100 years and more. And most dangerous of all, the marriage settlement itself, the small stone on which Eleanor's whole independence stood, was quietly challenged on a buried technicality that would, if it were allowed to hold, strip her of even the modest allowance that had let her raise the mill. Rook came to her one grey afternoon and laid the thick sheaf of eviction papers on her desk with his soft grey smile, fully expecting the dull Duchess to weep, or to plead, or simply to sign where he pointed and be done. Eleanor looked at the papers for a long, still moment. She read the top sheet, and the second, and the third, and her face gave nothing away. And then she thanked Mr. Rook very courteously and said that she would of course wish to review such important documents at her leisure before doing anything at all. He mistook her calm entirely for the paralysis of a defeated woman, and he left well satisfied. He did not understand that he had just, with his own soft grey hands, delivered to her the single last document she had needed. The eviction papers, forged and dated and signed in his own unmistakable hand, closed the final gap in her chain of proof. Now the case was whole. Now, at last, she could act once completely, and never need to act again. She did not do it quietly, because the wound had never been a quiet one. Rook's fraud and Camille's theft had been worked in the open, at assemblies and dinners and in the drawing-rooms of the county, in front of the very same 40 families who between them ruled that whole corner of England, and so Eleanor determined that the reckoning would happen in the open too, in the same rooms, before the same eyes, where the damage had been done. But first she went to the one person whose weight could keep the case from being smothered in a gentleman's agreement. She went to the Dowager Duchess Agnes, Julian's own mother, a formidable and iron-spined old woman who had never once troubled to hide her low opinion of the merchant's daughter her son had been obliged to marry for money. Eleanor requested an audience, and was granted a cold one, and she came into the Dowager's dim sitting-room and laid the two ledgers side by side on the small table between them, the false and the true, and she said only this, that the choice now before the family was not whether there would be a scandal, for the scandal was already certain, but whether the ancient name of Haramere would survive its own solicitor or be dragged down with him, and that she, Eleanor, had no wish in the world to see the family ruined, but every intention of seeing it cleaned. Then she fell silent, and she let the old woman read. Agnes read for the better part of an hour without speaking a single word, turning the pages of the true ledger with a hand that grew, very slowly, less steady. She saw the forged leases. She saw the money bled from the accounts of her husband and her husband's father. She saw the eviction papers made out against families whose names she had known since her own girlhood. And at the very end of it she closed the ledger, and she raised her eyes to her son's discarded wife, and on her hard old face was an expression Eleanor had never once seen there before, and did not at first recognize, because she had never had cause to look for it. It was respect. "I have always thought my son a fool," the dowager said at last, in a dry voice like the turning of an old page, "and it is a very great comfort, at my age, to be proven so entirely right, and by so competent a woman." She chose the name over the son. And with the old woman's formidable weight now set squarely behind it, the case could no longer be quietly smothered by anyone. The reckoning was held not in a slow and distant court, but in the county assembly rooms, and Eleanor chose that ground on purpose, because the courts of law moved with the speed of cold treacle, while the county moved with the speed of gossip, and because she understood better than any lawyer that public opinion, once properly turned, is a verdict against which there is no appeal. The 40 families came, drawn helplessly by the scent of a great scandal, filling the long room in their finest clothes, murmuring and craning. Rook came, still soft, still grey, still privately certain to the last that a mere woman could not truly unmake a man of law and business. Camille did not come. Camille, with the fine, sharp instinct of her kind, had already begun to smell the turning of the wind, and had begun to make her own quiet arrangements. And into that crowded, rustling, expectant room walked Eleanor, Duchess of Harrowmere, in a plain grey gown among all that silk, and she took her place before the people who had spent 5 years pitying her when they remembered her at all, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not weep, and she did not tremble. She laid out the evidence the way she laid out everything in her life, one clean cold fact set carefully upon the last, each one a dressed stone laid upon the one before it, until the wall she built was too high for any man in the room to see over or climb. She read the forged leases aloud, slowly, and then she read the true originals beside them, and let the room hear the difference. She traced the vanished money out loud from the Harrowmere accounts into Rook's, and from Rook's into an account opened in the name of Camille Vasseur at a discreet bank in the city of Bath. She called the nervous young bank clerk, who confirmed it all in a shaking voice that grew steadier as he went, as a man's voice does when he finds he is at last being believed. She produced Mrs. Pell's retained letters. And then, at the last, she called the tenants themselves, the Bardens and the Holts and the widow Cray, who came forward one after another in their good Sunday clothes and testified in plain, unhurried, unanswerable words to what had been done to them, and to who it was who had quietly stopped it. The long room, which had come only to be entertained by a scandal, grew first very quiet, and then it grew very still, and then, family by family, it grew angry, and the anger was not turned upon the dull Duchess in the plain grey gown. It was turned exactly, precisely, where she had, with years of patience, aimed it. When at last she had laid down the final document, Eleanor turned and faced not the magistrates but the 40 families, the whole rustling room of them, and she spoke the only words that afternoon she had truly prepared, and she spoke them without heat. For 5 years, she said, I was told what I was. I was loyal, and I was dull, and I suspected nothing. I was a woman who kept a house and asked no questions. I did not argue, I let it be said, because a woman who is thought to see nothing is shown everything. She let that settle. I saw all of it, I wrote all of it down. And I did not come here today to be pitied or to be believed a wronged wife, because I am neither. I came to lay the truth on this table where the lies were told, and to ask you only this, now that you have seen it, what will you do with what you know? No one in that room ever forgot it. Rook, who had sat through the whole of it with his soft grey composure fixed like a mask, chose that moment to make his single fatal error. He rose, and he said in his patient tone that it was a great deal of clever arithmetic for a lady, and that figures could be made to say anything by a mind inclined to hysteria. And the room, which a year before might have murmured its agreement, turned on him as one animal, because they had just watched the arithmetic stand up in the persons of the Bardens and the Holts and the widow Cray. And there is no defence in the world against a wronged man in his Sunday coat telling a plain true thing in a plain true voice. Rook saw it turn. For the first time his grey face lost its colour, and he sat back down, and he said nothing further, because there was nothing further that could be said. Justice fell that season by the exact degree of each person's guilt, which is the only kind of justice that has ever truly satisfied the human heart. Mr. Rook, who had done the forging and the stealing with his own soft grey hands, was prosecuted at the assizes for fraud and forgery, and the evidence laid against him was so complete and so plainly documented that his own hired counsel scarcely troubled to mount a defence, knowing it hopeless. And Rook was stripped of his practice and his property and his good grey name, and was transported beyond the sea to a distant colony where no living soul would ever again trust him with so much as the keeping of a laundry list. Camille Vasseur, who had taken the jewels and the money and the man, received in the end the exact punishment that her own cold logic had always guaranteed her, though no court ever sentenced her to it. She was cut off from every last farthing the very moment the stolen money stopped flowing, and she discovered, as such women always discover too late, that a woman who wants a man for the having of him and never for the keeping has no one at all in the world the instant the having ends. She decamped from her lodgings in Bath one night, owing 3 months' rent to a landlord she had charmed and never intended to pay, and she drifted on to some other watering place to begin the same patient work upon some other vain and lonely fool. And the last word anyone ever had of her was that she had grown thin and hard and quite friendless, undone at the finish, not by Eleanor's hand at all, but by the simple, pitiless arithmetic of her own heart, which had never once, in all her scheming life, added up to love. And Julian, far away beneath the bright, indifferent sun of Vienna, received one morning a letter from his mother, written in her dry, unsparing hand, which told him without a grain of softness exactly what his house had become in his absence, and exactly who it was who had saved it, and who had not. And the Duke of Harrowmere, for the first time in his easy, unexamined life, felt the cold of something he could not charm or buy or ride away from, and he called for his trunks, and he came home. He came home the way we began this story, stepping down from the carriage in the grey light of a Harrowmere morning, so certain of his welcome that he did not glance back at the woman on his arm. And he found the great gates standing open, and the fires lit, and the accounts in perfect and profitable order, and for one long foolish moment he mistook all of it for the old life simply resuming. The wife against the wall, the house at his careless command. And then he saw her. Eleanor came out onto the steps to meet him, because she was the mistress of that house in truth now, and it would have been beneath her dignity to hide from any man, least of all this one, and she was not, in any particular, the woman he had left standing there 5 years before. There was no anger at all in her face, and the absence of it frightened him far more than any fury could have done, because anger he might have understood, might even have found a door in. There was no grief. And there was no hope. She greeted him with the exact same distant, unfailing courtesy that he had shown her every day of their marriage, the smooth courtesy one gives a competent stranger. And she informed him plainly and in order of the true state of his estate, of the solicitor transported and the money recovered, of the woman gone and the debts she had left, of the mill that now hummed and the tenants who were now safe. And she did all of it without once reaching, by so much as a flicker, for his forgiveness or his approval or his love, because she had discovered in his absence that she no longer had the smallest use for any of the three. Julian stood on his own steps and looked at his wife, at the calm and sovereign and utterly unreachable woman, standing where he had left a frightened and hopeful girl, and he began slowly, the way slow men come to understand everything, far too late, to grasp the full size of what he had thrown away with both his careless hands. He tried, in the strange and lengthening weeks that followed, to find the door back into her regard, and it is the closest thing to sympathy this story will grant him, that he tried at all. He was gentle now. Where he had been indifferent, he was attentive. Where he had been absent, he was even, in his clumsy way, humble, a posture so foreign to him that it sat on him like another man's coat. He praised her management of the estate to her face and to others. He sought her opinion at dinner and pretended, not very well, to have wanted it all along. He took to standing a little too long in doorways she was likely to pass through, hoping, plainly, that she might one day look up and see in him something she had lost. And Eleanor was never once unkind to him, and here is the thing he could not bear and could not name. Her kindness was the proof of her indifference. Because unkindness would have required her to still feel something, some hot live thing that could be provoked, and she felt nothing of the kind. Her heart, which had turned toward him faithfully and hopelessly for so many cold and barren years, no longer turned toward him at all. It had turned, quietly, in the long free quiet of his absence, toward the man in the plain shiny elbowed coat who had asked her opinion at the sluice gates, and then had actually listened to the whole of her answer, and it had stayed turned there, steady and rooted, the way a plant that has at last found its window stays turned toward the light, and cannot be argued out of it, and would not if it could. Thomas Aldern had never left. That was the whole of it, in the end the plainest and the most powerful fact in the entire story, and it is worth saying slowly. When the fashionable world grew bored of Haramir and looked away, Thomas had stayed and mended its rotting mill board by board. When the tenant families were threatened with the loss of everything, it was Thomas who had ridden the length and breadth of the county in the rain, gathering their testimony and copying their leases. When Eleanor sat up past midnight over her 2 ledgers, it was Thomas who trimmed the lamp and checked her figures and said nothing of the hour. And when the great reckoning was finally over and the house had gone quiet and safe, it was Thomas who was still simply there, not pressing, not asking anything of her at all, only present, the way the sun is present, reliable and warm and making no demand. And Eleanor discovered in that quiet aftermath that the small warm thing which had turned over in her chest at the sluice gates all those seasons ago had a name after all, and that she was no longer the least bit afraid to say it, if only to herself. And there was a complication of the pleasant sort that a well-made story keeps hidden in its pocket for the very end. Thomas, it slowly and then suddenly emerged, was not only a plain land agent from the north. He was the second son of a northern earl, and by the recent death of his elder brother, he had become the heir to a title and to estates of his own. A man who had spent his whole youth learning land honestly from the mud upward, precisely because he had wished, above everything, to be valued one day for what he could do, and not for what he happened to be born to inherit. He had come to Harrowmere in a plain coat entirely on purpose, and he had fallen in love with a woman he sincerely believed to be a steward's clever wife, and when at last he learned that she was in fact a duchess, it changed nothing whatever in him, not by a hair, because he had already chosen her long before for the only thing that had ever mattered to him, which was exactly who she proved to be when she believed that no person of importance was watching her at all. He was, in every particular, the perfect opposite of Julian. He valued her for her mind and not her money, for her work and not her rank, for her company and not her convenience. Eleanor's marriage to Julian was, in the fullness of time, quietly and lawfully dissolved, as such things could be dissolved by those who possessed the will and the evidence and the formidable help of a dowager duchess who had at last found a daughter worth the name. And not one soul in the whole county blamed Eleanor for it, because the whole county had sat in the assembly rooms and watched with its own eyes as she saved them. And in the following spring, in the small grey stone church at the very edge of the Harrowmere land, with the clean smell of the mill's fresh-cut timber still hanging in the air, Eleanor married Thomas Aldern. She did not marry him in silk before 400 fashionable strangers who cared nothing for either of them. She married him in good plain wool before the people who had earned, with their loyalty and their labour and their courage, the right to stand and see it done, the Bardens and the Holts, the widow Cray with her apprenticed orphans scrubbed and beaming in the front rows, Mrs. Pell weeping frankly and without the least shame into a large handkerchief, and the Dowager Duchess Agnes sitting very straight and very still, with an expression that on any softer woman would have been called, without hesitation, joy. It was, everyone agreed for years after, the warmest wedding the county had seen in a generation. And it was warm for precisely the reason that it was the least fashionable, because every single person in that small church had chosen to be there out of love and gratitude and nothing else at all. And when it was done, Eleanor walked out into the wide spring light on the arm of the man who had stayed, a woman who had been chosen at last for all the right reasons by exactly the right man, and who had also, and this was the part she held most quietly and most fiercely to her own heart, chosen him in return, freely, with open eyes, out of no need and no fear, but only the plain glad wanting of him. Julian remained at Harrowmere in the reduced and shadowed way that the reduced must, for the estate had been saved, but the man had not, and he lived out the remaining years of his life as a kind of permanent guest in the life he had so carelessly squandered, watching always from a little distance as the woman he had discarded flourished and deepened and was happy with somebody else. To his one small and belated credit, he never once pretended, to himself or to others, that it was anything other than his own doing. And once, near the end of it all, at a county gathering he had not expected her to attend, he found himself standing for a moment beside Eleanor at the edge of the room, and he spoke to her low, and without any excuse in his voice. He said that he had been the very poorest kind of fool, The kind who mistakes a living treasure for a mere fixture only because it never once complained of being taken for granted. And that he was sorry, truly and uselessly sorry, and that he did not for a moment expect his sorrow to matter to her or to change anything at all. And Eleanor, who bore him no hatred, because hatred, exactly like love, requires a turning of the heart that she could simply no longer perform in his direction, told him gently and plainly that it was true, that it did not matter now, and that this was not said in cruelty but only as a fact, the way one states the weather, and that she wished him. Without the smallest warmth and without the smallest malice, well, it was the last time the two of them ever spoke of what had passed between them. Forgiveness, she had learned across all those long years, is not the same thing as return, and the two must never be confused. A woman may forgive a man completely, may wish him no harm, may even pity him, and still never once walk back through the door he left standing open behind him, because the forgiving and the returning are two entirely different acts, and only ever one of them is owed. Years and years later, in a warm farmhouse that smelled always of the mill and of fresh bread and of children, Eleanor kept a locked drawer still, though it no longer held the evidence of anyone's crime. It held instead the small plain book she had once filled, entry by patient entry, with her cold observations in the cold years, and beside it a single folded letter she had written to herself in the very worst winter of her first marriage and had never sent to anyone, because it had only ever been meant for her. And sometimes, when one of her daughters came to her troubled and stung by the world's low and casual estimate of clever girls, Eleanor would unlock the drawer and take out that old letter and read a little of it aloud in the firelight. It said that a woman's worth is not, and never was, in being chosen, because being chosen is a thing that can be given by a fool and taken away again by the same fool on the same whim. It said that a woman's true worth is in what she builds with her own two hands, and in whom she saves when she has the power to save them, and above all, in how she treats those with less power than herself in the hours when no one at all is watching to reward her for it. It said that patience, properly and coldly aimed, is not weakness, but only revenge waiting with folded hands for its right moment. And on the last page, in a hand younger and more uncertain than the woman who now read it aloud, it said one thing more, which Eleanor always saved for the very end and read slowly so that her daughters would carry it. It said, "They will tell you your value is in whether you are wanted. Do not believe them. Your value is in what you are, whether a single soul ever wants it or not, and the day you know that in your bones is the day no man can ever leave you again, because you will already be whole when he goes, and whole when he returns, and whole is a thing that cannot be given and cannot be taken, but only grown, alone, in the dark, in the years when no one is watching." Her daughters grew up on those words the way other children grow up on prayers, and every one of them learned to reckon a column of figures before she learned to curtsy, and not one of them ever waited on a cold step for a man who was not coming back. And it said, at the very last, that the sweetest revenge of all is not to ruin the one who wronged you, satisfying as that may be to watch, but simply and quietly to grow, in his long, careless absence, into someone so much larger and truer than the small thing he left behind, that his small hands could never again have held you, even if you had let them try. The Duke of Harrowmere had come home after 5 long years, so certain of his welcome, expecting to find his wife exactly where he had set her down, waiting still to turn toward him like the only flower in a dark room turns toward the only candle it has ever known. He found instead a woman rooted at last in richer ground, turned wholly toward a truer and a warmer light, and her heart, after everything, after all of it, no longer turned to him at all. And if you have ever quietly wondered whether the patient ones, the overlooked ones, the ones the fashionable world forgets and the proud leaves standing on the steps, ever truly win in the end, then I want you to remember Eleanor of Harrowmere, who did not scream and did not scheme, and did not once beg, and who won every single thing that was ever worth the winning by the simple and devastating act of moving on. Her worth was never in being chosen. It was in choosing, at the last, herself, and then a life, and then a love that stayed. So tell me now in the comments, honestly, whether you believe she was right to feel nothing at all when he came home. And tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight, and if this story has moved you even a little, then subscribe and stay close, because there is always another great cold house with a careless duke in it, and there is always another quiet woman inside it, about to become the very last thing he ever expected to find.